So hello again, and thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. I am looking over here because that's where my notes are, so sorry for the lack of eye contact. Um, in preparation for this talk, first of all, after I got over my resistance to it, I basically asked what needs to be said and what needs to be heard. And so what came through did not feel very linear. So I feel like I have sort of grabbed a whole bunch of things, threads of different things that are happening in my life and things that are happening in the world. And the image I have is like a scoop of mashed potatoes on a plate. So I encourage you to take what you like and leave the rest and buckle up because hopefully this will make some kind of sense. So the first thought I started with was the phrase, be whole as the universe is whole. Not perfect, but whole. And so that's the foundation where I began. And I started thinking about the Big Bang theory, the universe exploding. And it's, in my mind, it seems like it's like a house blowing up, but like on a massive scale. So things are flying everywhere. It is chaotic and even dangerous. You could get hit by some of that floating debris. But the earth was birthed from chaos. Life came from chaos. And so it occurs to me that expansion is chaotic and dangerous, even. I mean, just ask anyone that looks like an immigrant these days. It's dangerous out there. But the quote from Trungpa Rinpoche floated up into my mind. Chaos should be regarded as extremely good news. And this was the first email I sent to Joe after having been at Loose Leaf Hollow the first time. And he wrote back and said, I can't believe you said that because I'm writing about that right now. So here we are again in chaos. And maybe when things get really wild, it's a sign of growth. And maybe when things are breaking down, we can see the opportunity for expansion. I got an email about a seminar with Francis Weller, and he's the grief master, so of course I'm going to sign up for it. But a quote caught my eye. He says, "The process of change is not one of addition and growth, but one of letting go, decay, subtraction, and death. It's a via negativa, a road of negation." And so if we're in the realm of letting go and decay, subtraction and death, letting go, anytime we're talking about these things, what we're really talking about is grief, deep grief. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation. When we're talking about these tumultuous times, like that's an understatement, I think. So here we are. What are we going to do about it or not do about it, as the case may be? So the image that I had, the screensaver, is a woman surfing an enormous wave. And when I was looking for that, I got a little sidetracked, as I do whenever I'm out on the World Wide Web. And I watched a video about what you can do to kind of like handle the impact zone of a giant wave. And so I watched this guy get pummeled by a wave, and his advice was focus on your breath, relax, and tell yourself you're going to be all right, which kind of feels counterintuitive. I have been in waves and I have tried bracing. That seems to be like what my reaction wants to be. Something big is coming. So, like, brace for it, tighten up. And that's a choice. We could do it. Um, we could resist the huge waves of change, of chaos, of grief or rage or whatever these big emotions or sensations are, whatever we would call them. We have that choice. Or we could do as this guy did, which is to soften and allow ourselves to get tumbled. And it hurts. I've been there, I've done it. We can moderate and soothe our own nervous systems, and we can trust that we'll be okay. So I do try resistance all the time. That is my nature, I think, to say no first. But more and more, I make that no a yes. I think, so for me, I'll give you an example of how it's clear in my own life, this dance between expanding and contracting. So I think about my life in like two separate phases. There is the before the catastrophe of having a child and losing my husband in less than 2 weeks. And then there's the after. So the before me was I would describe her as fairly constricted, pretty tense, kind of frozen, pretty grabby. I had a persona that I guarded pretty carefully. And that really kept me pretty small because, God forbid, I make some sort of misstep and reveal that I am not the perfect good girl who has all the answers. And I would say that's what contraction feels like. When I think about contraction, I feel like tense and sweaty. After, when the tidal wave came and wiped everything out, I was really stripped of all my defenses. And looking back, I can see that I did have a choice. I could have resisted. I could have tried to go back to what my life was, to go back to like normal. But in that moment, somehow, some wisdom greater than me flowed through, and I knew that I needed to let go. I did do that consciously, but I really did not know that I was actually choosing expansion. I just somehow knew that letting go was the path of lesser resistance. And I mean, I just, that's very uncharacteristic of how I was. Now, I will say that the rigid, controlling version of me is still in there, and she comes out. She comes out. She came out before I had to do this talk because she was like, I don't want to. But as I said, more and more choosing to relax. And I'll say too, it's tempting to think that that catastrophe or catastrophe in general is bad. I have been doing this nonstop with all the chaos in our country, government in shambles. I'm like, that's bad, it's horrible. And I mean, it kind of is. It doesn't feel good, I'll say that much. But my own personal catastrophe led me to incredible blessings for which I am forever grateful. So once again, I have to come back to the question that I ask myself all the time, you know, can I see this moment as an opportunity for expansion? I see a lot of, attempts to kind of try to go back too. You know, it's actually like clinging. And this is the next series of questions that I ask myself, you know, What am I holding on to so tightly? In thinking about, all of this collapse, why am I characterizing it as awful, aside from the suffering, the obvious suffering? So a couple weeks ago, Deb Ackerman did a beautiful talk about fasting and how that led her to looking around her living space and noticing things that she was clinging to, and then thinking about why she was holding on to those things, and then making the decision to let some of them go so that she could create a more authentic and joyful living space. And when she said that, I really got my attention because I had been thinking about emotional clinging. And asking those same questions about what stories am I holding on to and why? What purpose do they serve? So I think in this case, expansion requires letting go. But for me, in order to let go, I had to know what I was holding on to. So I've been pondering some relationships and chewing on some resentments. And so that's where I started asking, what is this doing for me? Obviously, it's serving some kind of purpose because I cannot put it down. Like I keep going back and revisiting and reinforcing the resentments. So when I sat with that question, I had two distinct sensations. The first one felt like armor, very rigid and penetrable, things just bouncing off, nothing gets through. And I realized that was the fight response. That was me all puffed up, come at me, bro, because nothing's going to hurt me. The other was more of a sensation of insulation or padding, being wrapped up in a really thick blanket. So, I might hear some sounds, but it's muffled. I can't really feel a lot of things. So that I would call the freeze response. And so I was hanging on to my stories because I felt like they provided me with protection. I had a perception of safety, the illusion of being safe, whether it was that armoring and that rigidity, or if it was the insulation and the numbing. But the truth is, if I look further, if I peel that layer back, what I see is that both are rooted in fear, whether it's fear of being harmed or fear of feeling something I don't want to feel, which lurking under there was grief. Grief, right there. Grief about my own mortality, that everything dies. No wonder I want to avoid it. That hurts. I don't like feeling it. But what I realized most of all, that these are ways of avoiding authentic connection within myself. Now, this is a light bulb moment for a 2 on the Enneagram. Joe is probably going to do a little happy dance, I'm finally getting it. Whether I'm armoring or insulating, I am keeping myself from the direct experience of life. And disconnection is antithesis to wholeness. I could stop right there because that was okay, news to me. Because if my goal is to be whole, which seems achievable and reasonable and a good goal to have, then I really need to consider laying down my armor and unwrapping my blanket. Now, I will say that I need discernment here because it does not mean that I'm going to run out and be authentic. with everybody, particularly people who are not safe. So I can choose. I can discern how and when I protect myself instead of just unconsciously doing it and like reinforcing my rightness. I can decide. And I think that's important to note. As I move towards more authenticity within myself and more wholeness within myself, that is a much more grounded place from which to expand. Have to have roots before we can grow and expand. So that's my personal story about expansion. I like to say the micro version, and then there's the macro. Can we take this bigger? What would it look like on a larger scale? And for that, I would turn to something called Fierce Vulnerability. And this is a book by Kazu Haga. I listened to a talk he gave a few weeks ago, and here are some quotes that really resonated with me. He said, "Social change work is healing work on a larger scale." So I've heard that said before in certain ways, like, as I do my work inside, my exterior changes, but it really kind of made it concrete for me. Like, this is the leap, this is the connection I needed to make that leap between my own personal work, which can kind of sometimes feel a little like self-indulgent, or like, oh, I'm just going to do my personal work and the world out there will sort itself out.
I thought maybe baked potatoes and kale today.
um,
No.
I want a baked potato.
I'm muting everyone. I do too. I want someone else to make me a baked potato. So the micro work that I was just talking about can be applied to larger systems, cultures, and even countries. I really never thought about cultures and countries and systems needing healing. The other quote he said, which I want to mention, is, "Injustice is not a political thing as much as it is a manifestation of collective trauma." Now, I have been learning about trauma, whether it's my personal or collective or generational. And so this was a revolutionary thought. Speaking of revolutions, if you have watched any of Ken Burns' American Revolution, you'll have a decent sense of the traumas that make up the origins of the United States. The term fierce vulnerability came out of a conversation that Kazu Haga had with a friend about nonviolence and how they felt like they needed another word for that because it's misunderstood as passivity, as just love everybody and they'll change. And I definitely had that misconception. Nonviolence for me was completely out of reach because whenever I am confronted with injustice, what I want to do is come in with guns blazing and burn it all down. That is not nonviolence. It is tense, it's aggressive, and it's escalating. It's matching that energy, which only makes it bigger. And I would say too, it reminds me of that armoring stance. And it reminds me of that contracted, tense place. So these are not necessarily qualities we want, but I really felt like, I'll get this in the next lifetime, or when I've been back and forth 14 times like the Dalai Lama, because it's just out of reach for me right now. However, as someone who has learned about how trauma, and I know trauma is a overused word, so forgive me because I'm going to overuse it, and I already have. But how it shows up in ways, in behaviors, perceptions, whatever it is, that seem to not make sense. it gave me a whole new pathway to nonviolence. So before I go there, I do want to mention collective trauma. It's a couple examples. And one, you guys might already know this, but I'll say them anyway. We see it playing out in the conflict between Israel and Gaza, where the former victim of a Holocaust is perpetrating a Holocaust on another group. There is a renowned worker in the field of resilience and trauma and addictions, and his name is Gabor Mate. He's a survivor of the Holocaust, and so he illuminated that for me. I want to credit him for that. But also, again, looking at the American Revolution, I find myself aggravated watching it because wealthy white men could clearly feel the oppression by the king and by the royalty, and wanted to escape that, but they could not see themselves as oppressors. Abigail Adams saw it, but they didn't listen to her. So those are a couple of examples of how we're seeing this collective trauma play out in modern life, and then framing that injustice as collective trauma changes my approach entirely. A good question to ask when you're working like with a child who's acting out, we'll say, is what's the function of the behavior? And this is the same thing as me querying my stories. What is this doing for me? So there is a purpose, no matter how illogical it may seem. And so when I start thinking this way, my frame of reference completely shifts. I start thinking about what is hidden. What is the story that I'm not seeing? I see the surface. I see what's going on on one level, but I am curious about what's happening underneath it. And I don't even actually need to know that story that's running underneath. I just need to know that there is one, because then I can respond to that part. I can start responding to the wound versus the reaction. And, to tend a wound, I'm not coming in there with guns blazing at all. I am coming in there with love and compassion. And that is how I get to nonviolence. I wonder if you can even hear it in my voice. I do. I can hear a shift when I even talk from that place versus the reactive matching energy place. So fierce vulnerability really makes me think of the hero or the Shiro's journey, when, that moment when before entering the dark wood, we have to drop our armor, drop our weapons. In Inanna's descent, she takes everything off, all clothes, jewelry, all the trappings of persona, and goes into the unknown. You really have to be fierce in order to be that vulnerable. There's no way you can do it. You have to have both. I will say that it's also a posture of expansion. I will put down my defenses and be present to life as it is in this moment, in all of its beauty and all of its terribleness. So when I try that on, that approach of dropping my armor and tending to the wound,
I'm sorry, what, babe? Yeah, but I couldn't go.
Chaos as demonstrated in real life. So when I try that on, when I embody that, tending to the wound and dropping my armor, what comes in for me is the Great Mother. And she goes by many names, Pachamama, Gaia, Durga, Kali. That is the fiercest and most tender love of all. This is deeply rooted and deeply grounded, immovable. It makes me think of a mountain. You can't budge that. And this is the space where nonviolence can arise. This is how we stop the cycles of hurt people hurting people. This is where amends comes from, where you can be humble enough to admit what you were wrong and account for that. This is how we create structures built on healing and compassion. This hot mess of a life that is happening right now is an opportunity for collective healing. And that's what I want. More than I want to hold on to my stories, more than I want to protect or the illusion of protection. I want healing. But we can't do this on a large scale if we haven't or aren't willing to do it for ourselves. You can't give away something you don't already have. And that's how we come back to the micro version, and back to ourselves, and back to doing this work of letting go. So on a recent check-in with Joe, he does the thing where he says, has you breathe, and then like check in and drop down and see, what needs to be said, discern what's in my heart. And so I was doing my breathing, and what came to me was the image of the surfer emoji. If you guys know that on your phones, the surfer emoji on a very turbulent wave. And she was hanging in there. She was on the board navigating this chaos. And the message was that I have all of the skills I need to navigate the turbulence. And how reassuring that was. Because I haven't actually known that for at least 16 years. And so it felt wonderful and comforting to know that no matter how crazy it gets, I have the skills. And I'm going to say you probably do too, whether you know it or not. So I rarely know what I'm doing. I get thrown off the board often, daily, many times a day. I get hurt. I get scared. I try to resist. I surrender. I try to resist again and surrender, pick it up, put it down. And ultimately, I get back on the board. This is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. You can't help but be afraid, but you'll be okay. Thank you for letting me share.